For Sue Ann Hobson, appearance is everything.
She wished to keep up with the Joneses and be out in front most of the time.
When she lands a man willing to give her everything, you'd think she'd be happy. But satisfied is not in her vocabulary.
Her husband thought he was getting the Brady Bunch.
You're not my mom.
Unbeknownst to him,
I am now.
it was turning into the Addams Family.
There was hatred inside of her, deep down, kind of embedded in her soul.
And when Sue Ann unleashes her true self on her stepfamily,
I think my friend may have killed him.
all must beware.
What she brought about in that house was evil. There was no justification. There was no rationalization, and it makes no sense.
Cinderella's wicked stepmother abused the girl by not letting her go to the ball. She didn't put out a hit on her.
In 1977, Sue Ann Crum is trying to get her life on track. Getting zero support from her ex-husband, the 38-year-old single mom is forced to take a second job at a skating rink to support herself and her 12-year-old daughter, Suzanne.
For Sue Ann to take a part-time job at a skating rink had to be one of the lowest points of her life.
But it's here that she meets a man whom she believes will change her fortune.
Can I get a couple pairs of skates?
36-year-old single dad, Ed Hobson.
That's a real cute dress.
Ed had recently been widowed. His wife had died after a protracted and painful bout with cancer. And so he was doing everything he could to help his little boy to cope with it. So he started bringing Chris, his son, to the rink.
So, where do you work?
Oh, I'm just down at the plant.
Cute and all, Ed works at the local factory, which gives Sue Ann a bad first impression.
I'm thinking, about moving over to Overland Park.
Oh, that's an expensive area.
Yeah, so...
But her attitude quickly changes.
He happened to mention that his aunt had recently left him a legacy of nearly $200,000. In today's money, that would be nearly $1 million. And the funny thing is, he suddenly became much more good-looking in Sue Ann's eyes.
Would you like to go out to dinner sometime?
Yes, absolutely.
Really?
That sounds lovely.
Oh, I'll be back in just a few minutes, all right?
Okay.
All right, thanks.
When the couple begins dating, they seem like a perfect match. Their kids are even the same age.
Ed saw in Sue Ann a way out of his desperation, and she was willing to let him and his son come into their lives, something that Ed truly wanted, not only for his son, but for himself.
Wait a second, before we get started, there's just one thing I have to say.
Oh, Ed.
Will you marry me?
He had found a beautiful woman who was charming, and I think Ed saw Sue Ann as a trophy wife.
And I don't want you working here again. In fact, I don't want you working ever.
Thank you.
It made me so happy.
In December 1978, the couple weds, and the families come together for what Ed dreams will be his life's fairy tale ending. Little does he know, the woman he's marrying is set to spin this story in an evil direction. In the summer of 1960, 19-year-old Sue Ann turns heads when she shows up at a local drive-in.
Sue Ann was a real catch. She was beautiful. She dressed immaculately, and her hair was always coiffed in the style of the day.
Now watching the movie?
The only child from an affluent family, she quickly catches the eye of 20-year-old construction worker James Crum.
So what are you doing here?
I'm here with my friend.
James Crum was, from all accounts, a pretty straightforward, normal, blue-collar kind of guy.
Sue Ann is out of his league, but James isn't afraid to make a move.
Let's say you and I go out sometime.
I'd like that.
It's always a good thing for a guy to kind of date up, but it's looked down and frowned upon in terms of a woman kind of dating down. But these opposites came together and attracted in this whirlwind kind of love relationship.
How about I pick you up at your place today?
That'd be perfect. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Mother, father.
Sue Ann knows her parents, Ruth and Don, won't like James and doesn't care.
James.
James was not going to win the approval of Sue Ann's parents. That just made him all the more enticing.
Where'd you go to college, James?
I didn't. I went right into the workforce in construction.
Sue Ann was given everything she wanted in life, but she was also dominated by a very vindictive mother and a very possessive mother who had a specific idea of what her daughter should be like. And as an only child, she controlled Sue Ann, who she dated, what she wore.
Do you mind if I use the restroom?
We forbid you from dating him. You can't stop me.
Sue Ann's parents do everything they can to discourage the romance and pray it's just a phase. But a year later, their hopes are dashed.
We have some important news.
Even though her parents tried to restrict her from dating him, it increased the desire and led to Sue Ann getting pregnant by him.
We're expecting.
She saw this relationship with James Crum as a step away from the domination of her mother.
You are turning out to be such a disappointment. This wasn't planned.
Neither Sue Ann nor her parents are happy about the pregnancy, but there's only one option.
I don't want to be a total disappointment.
At this point, it was not common for young women to have children out of wedlock. She had to have an elopement. She would not consider anything else, so off they went.
After the wedding, Sue Ann moves in with James, both hell-bent on proving her parents wrong.
She now had somebody else to support her, James Crum, and she didn't need the financial support for her parents. And so she felt that she was independent enough, because she was so angry with the way they were treating her, that she just quit speaking to them.
James and Sue Ann, right? Yes. I've got this beautiful Ford, just came in this morning.
Although Sue Ann's finally free from her parents' rule, she's unwilling to give up the lifestyle they'd provided her.
What about this one?
That's a bit out of
A task that puts pressure on her construction worker husband.
It's a little out of your price range. I've got it set aside for a wealthy banker in town.
She wished to keep up with the Joneses and be out in front most of the time.
Go ahead, Sue Ann. Sit in there.
I'm gonna have to take on a second job if we're gonna afford this car.
Sue Ann had been taught that she had to appear perfect. This was not something she could walk away from. It was now part of her psyche.
If you love me, you'll buy this car for me.
It's a lot of money, but yeah.
Perfect.
To try to become a better provider, James took on 2 additional jobs. He was now working 3 jobs and still was not making enough money to satisfy his wife.
Money only gets tighter with the arrival of their son, Jimmy. The young couple's newest addition causes more financial problems and even greater resentment between the two.
I'm not eating that.
Why not? It's food.
A child on top of financial problems definitely does not help. That adds fuel to the flame.
Soon the new mom is forced to abandon her wants for baby Jimmy's needs.
Good enough,
I
but it's...
deserve better.
To blame your child for your financial situation? I think it definitely raises a red flag of something's not right here.
It's not good enough, James.
Despite their troubles, the couple stays together. After 4 years of marriage, Sue Ann and James have another child. This time, a girl named Suzanne. But Sue Ann takes a different approach to motherhood her second time around.
Sue Ann had the opportunity now to show up her mother, to show what it really was like to have a perfect daughter.
Creating a bond with Suzanne becomes the most important thing to her. Meanwhile, her son Jimmy is getting completely ignored.
That's absolutely devastating for a child to have to witness the love and care up close and personal in your house of another sibling. Definitely detrimental to the psyche of that individual.
Sue Ann, please put the bags down. Sue Ann, you can't leave us now. You cannot walk out on me.
Before long, Sue Ann's relationship with her husband is at rock bottom.
Don't keep walking, Sue Ann. How am I supposed to raise this kid on my own, huh? Look at us.
She tells James Crum Sr. that she is going to take Suzanne with her and that she thinks that Jimmy would be better off if he went with his dad. Not really any clear-cut explanation other than the fact that I don't want him.
9 years later, Sue Ann and her daughter are moving into a house with her new husband, Ed, and his son.
Chris! Where are you, bud?
It's only a matter of time before her evil ways reach new heights and destroys her new family's life.
Sue Ann was to her family what a scythe is to a wheat field. She simply cut down anything that got in her way.
I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Why?
Raising a child alone when they meet, Ed and Sue Ann Hobson are the answer to each other's prayers.
It looked like an opportunity for both of them to have a happier life in the sense that they'll meld the two families together.
When Ed married Sue Ann, he thought he was getting the Brady Bunch. Unbeknownst to him, it was turning into the Addams Family.
The newlyweds buy a modest home in the much sought-after neighborhood of Overland Park. For Sue Ann, everything is falling into place.
Sue Ann really wanted to show the world that she was successful, and living in Overland Park was proof to everyone that Sue Ann had made it.
This was the beginning of Sue Ann's dream. She was now able to stay at home, like her mother, with her daughter, and begin to live a life that she perceived was perfect. There was only one problem: Chris.
Chris! You need to get your things out of the family room.
The relationship she's supposed to be building with her new stepson gets off to a rocky start.
Chris!
Chris was a teenage boy. He didn't change his socks.
You're treating this place like a pig pen.
He drank out of a milk carton and put it back in the refrigerator. He did all of the things that irritate moms for eons of time.
What are you talking about? It's not that big of a deal. My dad lets me do this stuff all the time.
It's not just you and your dad anymore. You need to understand that.
I don't think Chris ever wanted to challenge his stepmom. I think the challenge was that Chris wasn't living up to what Sue Ann wanted him to be.
My dad is my dad, but you're not my mom.
She isn't the only one having problems with Chris.
Chris broke my book bag. Tell him to stay out of my room. He's ruining everything.
13-year-old Suzanne and her stepbrother are constantly at each other's throats.
Both to go away and
They're the same age, going to the same school, and in different sexes, and they weren't getting along, and they were running to each other's prospective parent, blaming the other one for things.
Leave your sister alone, Chris.
When Chris complains to his father about Sue Ann, Ed takes his son's side.
There must be another explanation. I don't think he went in there and ridiculous.
Chris was a disruptive force in the house and in the marriage between Ed and Sue Ann. And it's completely centered around Chris and Ed's devotion to him.
He's a very good kid. He's doing very well since he...
And that caused a problem because Sue Ann wanted Ed's devotion to be to her, not to his son.
He needs to get his act together, and you need to take control of him. I am tired of it.
To get away from Chris, young Suzanne turns to an unlikely ally, her now 18-year-old biological brother, Jimmy. The two haven't seen each other in 8 years.
Is this Jimmy? Jimmy Crumb?
Suzanne reached out to her brother, probably from a natural curiosity. Maybe she wanted to enlist him as an ally in the house.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could meet at the park.
This is someone her mother doesn't want her anywhere near, as Jimmy's life is on a downward spiral.
After James and Sue Ann divorced, things were terrible for Jimmy. His father began to drink a great deal and could no longer take care of his son. Jimmy had become kind of a ruffian. He was getting into minor scrapes with the cops and perhaps using drugs.
Against Sue Ann's wishes, Suzanne secretly meets Jimmy.
I think siblings always relate.
I can't remember the last time I saw you.
Suzanne started to sympathize for Jimmy and be empathetic towards her brother about not being the chosen one and kind of feeling bad about it, that she was actually the one that was chosen.
I've missed you and Mom.
Even though his mother left him behind, Jimmy tells Suzanne he still wants to be a part of her life.
I want to see her again, but I don't know what to do.
There's no doubt that he wanted the love and affection of a mom. He'd missed it. He hadn't had it.
I just want us to be a family again. I want you to move back in.
Finally, after a couple of weeks of sneaking visits, Suzanne talks her mother into inviting Jimmy to the house for a reunion.
Sue Ann's motivation to bring Jimmy back into her life was an honest intention to reestablish a relationship with her son.
Are you hungry? Can I get you something to eat?
She was guilt-ridden.
I'm okay.
And she wanted to make amends.
Oh, no. That's, I'll clean it.
Seeking his mother's approval after being tossed aside at 9 years old, Jimmy's on his best behavior.
He was very much enamored with and sought out his mother's attention and love. And that made him very respectful.
After several meetings, Sue Ann decides Jimmy is just the right person to enlist in fixing her problems with stepson Chris. With this self-serving motivation, she convinces Ed to let Jimmy move into their home.
This is great. This is my room?
It's all yours.
Naively, even Chris is excited about the new housemate.
He loved having Jimmy around because Jimmy was streetwise and had lived by himself and he was cool. And younger brothers just look up to their big brothers.
You want to go outside, kick the ball around?
Chris, this isn't a good time. Jimmy has to unpack.
Okay.
Jimmy becomes a model son, a stark contrast to his stepbrother Chris.
He was going to follow the rules. I think that he wanted anything but to be abandoned again.
He really buckled down on his schoolwork. He had been a C student, but now he was bringing home B's.
Hey, what are you guys looking at?
But Jimmy's self-improvements aren't rubbing off on Chris.
Chris! How many times have I told you to use a coaster?
I'm sorry, I forgot.
I have to repeat myself again and again and again, and you just don't get it!
The young boy continues butting heads with his stepmother.
Such a slob! I can't stand it!
Sue Ann so disliked Chris that she dropped all pretense. She began to call him names in front of people. Never her husband, but in front of other people. It was clear to anyone who would listen that she could not stand Chris Hobson.
And without Sue Ann's desired results, it isn't long before Jimmy starts feeling her wrath too. The stress of being the prodigal son is just too much.
B-, Jimmy. This isn't good enough.
Sue Ann had a vision of what she wanted Jimmy to be, and as hard as Jimmy tried, whether it was grades, attitude, he never could achieve it.
I worked really hard on that.
You need to work harder.
He simply couldn't deal with the pressure of Sue Ann's constant demands for perfection.
Apply yourself.
So he began to go back to his old ways.
The troubled boy starts hanging with the wrong crowd at school.
It was easy for him to return to that kind of a lifestyle. I think things went downhill from there.
One day, Ed and Sue Ann find a stash of marijuana in Jimmy's room.
We take you into our home, and this is how you repay us? Just take your things and leave.
They promptly kick him out.
Jimmy was very upset because Jimmy was once again finding himself on the outside looking in.
Mom, I can explain.
You don't need to explain anything. Chris told us everything. Just go.
When Jimmy was told that his new brother had ratted him out, he was horrified. He was angry and saddened and disappointed and betrayed.
Needing a roof over his head, Jimmy moves into a nearby apartment where he starts plotting a way back into his mother's heart and home. In April 1980, the couple of 2 years returns home from a dinner date. Suzanne is home, but Chris is nowhere to be found.
Have you seen Chris?
He was here when I got in the shower, but I haven't seen him since.
She said I was taking a shower and Chris was in his room doing his homework. Suzanne said that when she came out of the shower, Chris was gone. Ed walks all through the house looking for Chris, doesn't find him. It seemed like he simply disappeared.
Nothing appears out of place in the home until Ed walks into the basement.
When Ed was looking for Chris, he noticed that his shotgun was missing.
We have a missing 13-year-old and a missing shotgun. At this point, Ed's scared to death.
Ed quickly calls the Overland Park Police Department for help.
You think Chris had any reason to run away?
No.
Chris's father tells them he has no idea why his son would leave the home with a shotgun.
Ed told us that there were issues in the family and that there was some tension.
He had been having some troubles with Jimmy and Suzanne.
But it was the typical kinds of things you find in every family.
Well, they've been arguing, getting into fights. I don't see why he would leave because of that.
Sometimes you go with the simplest solution is the correct solution. And this would have been the simplest solution, that he just ran away.
Child gun violence is almost unheard of in 1980, so police aren't too concerned over the missing weapon either.
Young kids do strange things. It's not inconceivable that the 13-year-old boy takes a shotgun with him for protection or to shoot small animals or some other illusion he has of now becoming a person who lives out of doors.
But detectives will soon learn that troubles in the home have led to a much darker scenario.
There's really absolutely no way to fully predict the diabolical nature of it all.
My God, it still brings tears to my eyes.
Oh my God.
Do you think Chris had any reason to run away?
No.
In April 1980, Sue Ann Hobson's stepson Chris goes missing, along with his father's shotgun, though Overland Park police officers don't seem that worried.
I think Ed knew something was wrong right then. He didn't know what it was, but he knew something was wrong.
You'll be back.
Police issue an APB and begin scouring the area for the missing 13-year-old boy.
The longer it went, the more concerned Ed got. I think that he thought he would come home because whatever was bothering him would dissipate and go on.
Sadly, by morning, there's still no sign of Chris.
This just wasn't a lark. This wasn't something where he just decided not to come home. Something was amiss.
Days pass by, and still no word from Chris. Then, police receive their first lead in the missing persons case.
The police got a call from a man who had gone to a popular shopping mall. He said that he had found a wallet that had a library card in it that said Chris Hobson.
Finding Chris's wallet dispels the prevailing theory of what happened to the missing boy.
If Chris had run away, he would have kept the money with him.
The wallet was the opening bell of the case for me. From that moment on, I had a deep resolve to find out what happened to Chris and where he was at and bring him home if possible.
Police launched the biggest air and ground search ever in the Kansas City area to find Chris.
It was in the papers that he was missing, and a community came together trying to find this young boy.
This was the lost lamb. The lost lamb was out there somewhere, and everyone wanted to bring him home.
But the wider search for Chris turns up nothing. Investigators begin to fear the worst.
We had been looking all week for Chris Hobson. The longer that it went on, the more likely we believed he was the victim of foul play. And we assumed by now that he was very likely deceased.
Then on May 1st, a hot tip from an unlikely source lands in Detective Douglas's lap.
Douglas. I have information on the Chris Hobson case.
I received a telephone call from a young teenage woman who had said that she had information about the missing boy.
I think my friend Paul may have killed him.
Why do you think he was involved in the case?
The young woman claims she learned about what happened to Chris 2 weeks earlier from a friend named Paul Sorrentino.
She described that she had been at a party with Paul, and that Paul had been bragging that the missing kid was somebody that they had taken out and killed.
And you said his name is Paul?
Yes, Paul Sorrentino.
Detectives know the name well, but he doesn't fit the profile of a killer.
Paul Sorrentino was known to the police, but it was minor stuff. Paul, at that point, had been miles and miles away from anything approaching murder.
Then the tipster tells them something only someone intimately involved would know.
He said he took a shotgun from his home, took him out to the woods, shot him.
That information had never been released to the media, and no one knew it unless they had knowledge of what happened.
It was that point in time that everybody became laser focused and realized that our case had now come together.
Not wanting to tip their hand, detectives ask the caller if she's willing to help them with the investigation.
So we asked her if she would call Paul and to ask him about it.
Listen, would you mind coming down to the station? We can talk about this in person.
I'll help as much as I can.
We were chasing a lead. We didn't know where it would go.
Yeah.
She was able to call him while we were listening and recording on the other line.
Yo, what's up, Laura?
Look, I really wanted to talk about what you told me the other night. I can't stop thinking about it.
No, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to get anybody in trouble.
But she keeps talking to him and ferreting out pieces and ferreting out pieces.
Now, the body's already buried.
Paul doesn't give up the body's location, but he does hint at the motive behind the murder.
The tipster asked, why in the world would you kill this little kid?
I did it for a friend of mine, Jimmy Crumb.
Jimmy Crumb is fingered by his friend Paul Sorrentino as the mastermind behind the disappearance and murder
I did it for a friend as a favor.
of his stepbrother Chris Hobson.
At that point, the police were inclined to believe that Paul was telling the truth and Jimmy was involved.
Though as they're about to question the accused killers, there's another major break in the case. A day after secretly recording Paul's statement, two young boys are fishing in a secluded area about an hour outside of Overland Park when something grabs their attention.
They were exploring the area looking for worms, probably going to go back and do a little fishing. They spotted a red piece of clothing.
It seemed very unusual to them. So they investigated, they poked at it with a stick, and pretty soon they discovered that they were looking at a dead body.
Oh my God, no my,
The boys alert police, and soon the area is swarming with investigators.
The police moved away some of the dirt and found the fully clothed body of a boy somewhere between 10 and 15 years of age. The body could not have been there very long because it was not badly decomposed.
He had gunshot damage to his head, throat, and chest. I think law enforcement were aghast that something so horrible had happened to a young person.
Detective Douglas is immediately alerted about the remains.
We got a phone call from the coroner who indicated to us that they may have found the body we were looking for.
It's gotta be him.
Dental records confirm the victim is indeed Chris Hobson.
It was a somber moment. This is a child. No one is supposed to die when they're 13 years old. Nobody expects that to ever happen to their child.
Based on the evidence recovered from Chris's body, 2 different types of shotguns were used in the slaying, a 20 gauge and a 12 gauge.
When the medical examiner told police that one of the shells was a 12 gauge, which is exactly the type of shotgun taken from Ed Hobson's home, they knew that they had been given accurate information by the tipster.
Police know they have enough to haul Jimmy and Paul in for questioning. After arresting both boys, detectives start grilling Paul Sorrentino. When he doesn't say much, they play a tape of him already making a confession of sorts.
Now the body's already buried. I did it for a friend of mine, Jimmy Crumb.
When the phone call between the tipster and Paul Sorrentino was played for him, he said, "That's it. You. I'm going to get an attorney. I'm not talking anymore."
Detectives then try their luck with Jimmy. Surprisingly, he's not as tough.
There was something bothering him really bad. He was ashen-faced, sullen, and unlike Paul, he wanted to get it off his chest.
I wanted him dead because he got me kicked out of the house. I knew I couldn't do it alone, so I asked Paul to help me.
When Jimmy and Paul arrive at Sue Ann's house, they plan on luring Chris somewhere and shooting him.
Let's do this.
Even though Paul had brought a loaded 20 gauge, Jimmy wants his own weapon, so he too can have a hand in the murder. And he knows just where he can find one, his stepdad's collection.
What are you guys doing here?
Oh, Mom said I could borrow something from the basement, so I'm gonna go get that.
Shortly after putting the shotgun and a shovel in the trunk,
Okay, I got it.
Paul and Jimmy buddy up to Chris.
Are you cool? You're gonna go with us?
Yeah, I'm cool.
All right, let's go.
Let's go, man.
They convinced Chris to go out and do something that would have been certainly mischievous and certainly would have been a concocted story.
Ready to get in trouble?
They took off and headed toward a rural area outside town.
Where are we going exactly?
They drove around for about 45 minutes. Chris was getting kind of irritable. He hadn't seen any of this action he had been promised. Finally, Paul says, "Let's do it here." And they pull off into the woods.
Whoa, guns? What exactly are we doing here? Grab the shovel.
Paul and Jimmy take Chris deep into the woods and instruct him to start digging a hole in the dirt.
Start digging.
And they didn't tell him why.
Took about an hour to dig the hole, with Chris doing most of the work. At some point in time there, he became concerned. Number one, he was late, being home, and also understanding at some level that something bad was about to happen.
I want to go home.
He suddenly realized that this was not what he thought it was going to be, and it scared him and terrified him, and he questioned his stepbrother.
This isn't funny anymore. Keep digging, you little baby. Why are you guys doing this? Get in the hole.
I'm certain he felt terrified. I'm certain he felt panicked. I don't know why he didn't run, but he may have been paralyzed by the fear.
God, why are you doing this?
And he had the horror of not only seeing shotguns pointed at him, he saw that his own brother was pointing the gun at him.
This is for getting me kicked out of the house.
Jimmy counted 1, Paul counted 2, Jimmy counted 3, and they fired their weapon.
This particular confession from Jimmy put everything together. It spelled out all the clues that we knew before. It put them in proper context.
But just when it seems the story can't get any more sickening, Jimmy drops the ultimate bombshell.
I wanted him dead because he got me kicked out of the house. But I killed him because my mom asked me to. I wanted him dead because he got me kicked out of the house.
When 19-year-old Jimmy Crumb comes clean about killing his stepbrother Chris Hobson, detectives are floored to learn the real reason.
But I killed him because my mom asked me to. I wanted him dead because he got me kicked out, but...
Everybody said, oh no, that's crazy, and nobody wanted to believe that. What could have been so bad about this child that someone wanted to kill him?
You're treating this place like a pig pen.
According to Jimmy, Sue Ann hated her stepson, and the relationship was so bad that she feared it was going to drive her husband away.
Chris was a problem. He was, in her mind, the reason that this second marriage would come to an end. She had to get rid of him by any means necessary.
My mom called me and asked me to take care of Chris. I told her I would do it.
Jimmy was doing this to please Sue Ann, bring himself a little closer to Sue Ann.
Jimmy was waiting, it seemed, his entire life for the opportunity to be the son to the biological mother that he was born to. It's kind of like, I'm going for it, bar none.
I knew I couldn't do it alone, so I asked Paul to help me.
In the wake of Jimmy's statement, detectives bring Ed and Sue Ann to the station and quickly split them up.
Officer, can you tell me what's going on with my son? What news did they have?
Yes, we have bad news.
When the detectives told Ed that his son was dead, he basically collapsed into tears and disbelief.
Oh my God.
They also believed that Sue Ann had orchestrated this murder.
But she had nothing to do with it.
His anger and disbelief turned to shock and bewilderment. It's something that I don't think he could comprehend.
Meanwhile, across the hall, Detective Douglas confronts Sue Ann with Jimmy's confession.
Jimmy told me everything.
What?
He said that you wanted him gone.
Chris was my son. Why would I want to hurt him? You're making a mistake.
I think that she believed she was smart enough to talk her way out of it.
He must have gone too far.
But the more she talked, the more information she gave us.
Jimmy, it's Jimmy. He went too
After
far.
many hours of questioning, Sue Ann changes her story.
She got to the point where she did say, I did meet Jimmy. I did tell him something had to be done about Chris. I said, what did you think that meant? She said, that meant taking him out and beating him up or something. I said, really? I said, who else was with you? Well, nobody. Nobody at all? Well, Suzanne was with us.
Ask Suzanne. She'll tell you.
A short time later, Sue Ann's daughter Suzanne is brought to the station for questioning.
I think that Sue Ann did suspect Suzanne would cover for her and would be able to figure her way through that. But ironically, as her mother was leaving the room, she popped her head back in and said, just tell them the truth. And she did.
Suzanne, we just have to ask you a few questions about your mom and Chris, okay?
I turned to Suzanne and said, what did she mean? Something had to be done about Chris. Suzanne then said, she meant he's not going to come home. So you think that she wanted Jimmy to kill Chris? She goes, yes, that's what she wanted. It was crystal clear to Suzanne that her mother wanted Chris dead.
Furthermore, Sue Ann planned it so her daughter was out of the picture when Jimmy and Paul picked up Chris.
She would be in the shower so she would not see what was happening.
A few days later, Sue Ann confides to her daughter that Jimmy had indeed taken care of him. On May 3rd, 1980, detectives charged Jimmy Crum, Paul Sorrentino, and Sue Ann Hobson with Chris's murder.
Ed lost his son. In the back of his mind, he knows that his wife had the son killed. He also knows that he brought the instrument of the death into his home. It has to be a painful recollection that he cannot wipe away.
Ed quickly divorces his wife, but while she's out on bail, Sue Ann convinces him to have a change of heart, and they are remarried.
Sue Ann is a very persuasive woman. Somehow, before the trial began, he had reconciled with Sue Ann.
I think in Ed's mind, he had married above himself, and he was glad for that. He had an attractive wife, a polished wife, and he didn't want that to go away.
In April of 1982, Sue Ann goes to trial, maintaining her innocence. She puts all the blame for Chris's murder on her son.
Jimmy was absolutely incensed. He realized then just how disposable he was and what little value he held in her life.
Jimmy decides to testify against his mother and becomes the prosecution's star witness.
He looked straight into his mother's eyes and told the jury that she hired him to kill her stepson. It's got to be one of the most difficult things in the world for a boy to have to testify against his own mother.
My mother, Sue Ann Hobson.
Jimmy had to be psychologically damaged, hurt, and just all messed up. It's crazy that Jimmy, who she had so much control over for such a long time, sealed her fate.
The jury finds Sue Ann guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Jimmy and Paul are also convicted in the case. All three are sentenced to life in prison. The punishments bring some closure to the ordeal, but will never reconcile the senseless murder of a young boy by his stepmother.
Cinderella's wicked stepmother abused the girl by making her scrub the floor and not letting her go to the ball. She didn't put out a hit on her.
I hope I never meet a woman like Sue Ann Hobson, because her ability to spin a web of deceit and deception, and to manipulate people like she has her entire life, is scary as any fiction you'll ever read by Stephen King.
There are places that seem too ordinary to ever become part of history. A cafeteria in the middle of Texas is one of them. It is the kind of place people enter without bracing themselves, without scanning the exits, without imagining the floor might one day hold more than scattered napkins and the squeak of rubber soles. They come in carrying the weight of regular life, a lunch break cut short by errands, a grandmother with a handbag looped over her wrist, a retired couple moving slowly through the line, deciding between familiar meals, a young family trying to settle children into seats before the food cools. The air carries the soft heaviness of Grady coffee, fried food, steam, and conversation. Trays slide along rails, silverware clicks against plates, ice settles in plastic cups. In a place like that, people do not arrive expecting to survive anything, they arrive expecting lunch. That is what makes the memory of Luby's so haunting. It did not happen in a battlefield or a dark alley, or a place already stained by danger. It happened in a room built for appetite and routine under bright lights, among people who believed they were spending an ordinary day inside the safety of public life. On October 16, 1991, in Killeen, Texas, that illusion split open in a matter of moments. The world outside still had the hard brightness of a Texas day. Cars moved through streets. People kept appointments. Cash registers rang in nearby businesses. Somewhere a radio played a country song or the news, or an advertisement nobody would remember. The afternoon carried on with its usual indifference, as afternoons do right until it didn't. What entered that cafeteria was not just a man with a weapon. What entered was ruptured disbelief, and the sudden collapse of all the fragile assumptions that hold a society together. The assumption that the public room is safer than the private nightmare. The assumption that age, kindness, routine, and innocence count for something. The assumption that violence announces itself before it arrives. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it comes through the front of the building and leaves behind a silence so deep that even decades later, people still lower their voices when they speak of it. In the years since, the Luby's massacre has been recited in headlines, folded into arguments, invoked in legislative debates, and studied as one of the defining mass shootings in modern American memory. But before it became a reference point, before it was used to support speeches or policies or outrage, it was a room full of people. Men and women with habits, birthdays, family nicknames, medical appointments, half-finished plans for the evening, people who had survived wars, illnesses, grief, and hard marriages. People who had worked all their lives, who had learned to stretch money, who sent birthday cards, who called relatives on Sundays, who tipped waitresses, who prayed before meals, who argued about little things, who believed, perhaps stubbornly, in the humble goodness of normal life. That goodness is part of what gives the event its lasting shadow. It was not merely that many died, it was that the dead had been doing something so commonplace, so unguarded, so profoundly human. They had been sitting down to eat. Killeen itself stood as a city shaped by discipline and motion, a place with military rhythms never far from its pulse. Fort Hood loomed nearby, huge and permanent, its presence threading soldiers, families, uniforms, and deployments into the everyday identity of the town. In communities like that, people live with a certain awareness of danger in the abstract. They know war exists. They know violence can travel home in memory, in trauma, in telegrams, in folded flags. But the danger they imagine has edges. It belongs somewhere else first. It belongs overseas, or in the crime pages, or in the life of someone unlucky enough to have drawn a darker path. It does not belong in the steam of cafeteria vegetables, in the scrape of chairs across tile, in the afternoon lull when elderly customers linger over coffee and refillable drinks. Yet that was exactly the point where the national story changed. Luby's did not become infamous because it was famous before. It became infamous because it represented a space Americans recognized instantly. It could have been anywhere. That is the terror of it. Not only what happened, but where. Not only the number of dead, but the familiarity of the setting. A restaurant is supposed to be a pause from the world. A cafeteria especially carries a peculiar softness in the American imagination. It is not glamorous. It does not promise drama. It promises comfort, repetition, and the dependable mercy of a hot meal. It belongs to the elderly, the working class, church groups, children, and people who just want a plate that reminds them of home. To violate that space is to strike at something larger than the people present. It is to strike at the belief that there are still places where one can exist without fear. That belief bled heavily in Killeen. The man who would tear through that room had already been moving through the world with his own storms locked inside him, the kind of storms that often become visible only after catastrophe, when investigators gather fragments and try to build meaning from broken pieces. But in the beginning, those inner fractures are invisible to strangers. The customers at Luby's did not know his history, his bitterness, his collapse, or his intentions. To them, he was not yet a subject of investigation or a face on television. He was simply the rival of horror. That is how such events first exist to victims, not as biography, not as psychology, not as motive, but as impact, a sound too loud for the room, motion too abrupt to understand. A second in which the human brain refuses to accept what the eyes are seeing. There is always that instant. Survivors from mass violence often return to it again and again in memory. The instant before understanding catches up, the body knows first. The body hears the crash, the blast, the shattering, the unnatural rhythm. It feels the air change. It senses panic moving through other people like electricity. Then the mind, slower and more fragile, tries to name the impossible. This cannot be happening here. This cannot be happening now. But it is, and once it is, time changes shape. Minutes become entire worlds. Tiny choices become borders between life and death. The room that a moment before held lunch now holds instinct, terror, confusion, prayer, and the helpless witnessing of others' suffering. That transformation is central to the horror of Luby's. It was not only an act of killing, it was the violent conversion of a familiar public space into a killing ground. The details of that day would eventually be recorded in police reports, emergency response timelines, witness statements, courtroom records, and news archives. Yet no document can fully hold the emotional texture of the beginning, that crushing collision between the ordinary and the monstrous. To understand why the massacre endures in the American mind, one has to begin there, not with legislation or statistics, but with atmosphere, midday, plates, voices. A restaurant full of people whose names the nation did not yet know, an ordinary afternoon standing upright on its final seconds. In true crime, there is often a temptation to move quickly toward the most shocking detail, as though horror alone can carry a story, but the deeper wound of this case lives in contrast. Bright fluorescent light against sudden darkness of human intention, the warm smell of cafeteria food against the bitter chemical tang that would follow, the social choreography of a shared meal against the chaos of bodies seeking shelter where there was little to be found. The elderly are especially vulnerable to this contrast, because they trust routines they have earned. A younger person may still move through public space with a private edge of suspicion, but older people often carry habits formed over decades. They return to familiar places. They sit in familiar sections. They know which dish they prefer. They know the pace of the room. That rhythm, for many, is part of dignity itself. Luby's was full of such rhythms. Men and women whose movements had slowed, whose appetites were modest, whose days may already have been narrowed by age or illness, still took part in the simple ceremony of lunch. There is something especially cruel about violence intruding there, where so many of the victims were not in the expansive beginning of life but in its later, quieter chapters. They were not seeking excitement. They were tending to the small continuities that make a life recognizable. The massacre tore through those continuities with merciless speed. And yet, paradoxically, it is through those same continuities that the dead remain human to us now. If one sees only the scale of the event, one begins to speak in abstractions. 23 killed. Many others wounded. One of the deadliest mass shootings in American history at the time, a benchmark case, a political symbol. All of that is true, and none of it is enough. Numbers flatten the room. They cannot tell you about a person smoothing a napkin over their lap. They cannot tell you about the low murmur of older couples who have spent decades learning how to sit together in companionable silence. They cannot tell you about the tired waitress who has served hundreds of meals and assumes this one will be no different from the others. They cannot tell you how public tragedy always begins in private worlds. Each person inside Luby's carried one, a dentist appointment forgotten, a grandchild's photograph tucked into a wallet, a habit of salting food before tasting it, a hand that had buttoned a shirt that morning and would never do so again. A life may disappear in an instant, but it does not become small because the ending is sudden. If anything, the abruptness enlarges all that came before. The massacre did not create the value of those lives. It revealed how violently life can be interrupted. This is also why the case became larger than itself. The nation did not only see grief, it saw vulnerability in a place that felt democratic. A cafeteria does not belong to one class or one type of person. It is communal in the plainest possible way. People stand in the same line, make small decisions under the same menu boards, and sit in one open room under the same lights. To attack such a place is to expose how thin the walls of public safety can be. Americans watching the news in the days that followed did not have to imagine some rarefied or distant setting. They could picture the tray, the counter, the dessert section, the row of windows, the tables close together. Many had eaten in places almost identical to it. That familiarity carried the fear outward. From Killeen into living rooms across the country, it also carried anger. How could something so enormous happen so quickly? How could so many lives be extinguished in a room not built for defense? How was the public supposed to think about safety after that? Such questions would echo for years. But in the first moments, before politics sharpened around the case, what existed was raw human shock. Shock is not dramatic in the way films depict it. Often it is awkward, slow, disbelieving. It stares, it freezes, it repeats the same useless thought. It tries to make sense of a scene that has outrun reason. In the aftermath of Luby's, shock would cling not only to survivors, but to first responders, medical staff, family members, reporters, and an entire town suddenly forced to see itself in the mirror of catastrophe. Killeen was no longer just a military city in Texas. It had become the site of an American wound, and wounds like that are never only physical. They alter language. They alter habits. They alter the way people enter restaurants, choose seats, notice exits, watch strangers, and understand the word ordinary. The ordinary is never ordinary again once it has been broken so publicly. That is the true beginning of this story. Not merely the arrival of a gunman, but the end of innocence in a room designed for everyday life. The fluorescent lights still glowed. The trays still waited. The tables still stood where they had always stood, but after that day, nothing inside that frame would ever mean the same thing again. The Luby's massacre remains one of those events that seems to divide time into before and after. Before, a cafeteria was just a cafeteria. After, it became possible to imagine slaughter in the center of the mundane. Before, public safety was still, for many Americans, a broad assumption attached to places of commerce and routine. After, that assumption looked thinner, weaker, more conditional. Before, the people gathering for lunch in Killeen belonged almost entirely to themselves and their families. After, they belonged also to history, unwillingly, permanently, as part of a national vocabulary of grief. The hardest truth in cases like this is that history often arrives disguised as a normal day. No thunder, no warning written across the sky. Just weather errands, hunger, conversation, and a clock moving toward an hour that will later be repeated on news broadcasts and carved into memorial memory. The doors open, people enter, people eat. People assume the day will continue. Then history steps in with blood on its hands and demands to be remembered. That is where we begin, in the unbearable nearness of normal life to catastrophe, in a bright cafeteria in Killeen, Texas, where the ordinary afternoon of October 16, 1991, was about to become one of the darkest public massacres the country had ever seen. In October of 1991, Killeen, Texas, carried the kind of identity that looked simple from a distance and complicated up close. To a stranger passing through, it might have seemed like another central Texas city built out of asphalt, routine, and heat. A place where the sun pressed hard on parking lots and low commercial buildings, where pickup trucks gathered outside diners and stores, where the horizon often felt wider than the imagination of the people moving beneath it. But Killeen was never just a quiet Texas town. The presence of Fort Hood shaped nearly everything, even what was not immediately visible. It shaped the traffic patterns, the businesses, The housing developments, the bars, the churches, the mood of local conversations, the way people understood service and authority and sacrifice. Soldiers came and went, families arrived, unpacked, learned the streets, and then vanished again with the next transfer. Some people planted roots anyway, some retired there. Some opened businesses that depended on the constant current of military life. Others learned to live with a sense of provisional belonging, as if the town itself were always half in motion, always partly waiting for departure orders that might never come. That tension between permanence and movement gave Killeen its particular emotional weather. It was a city where people tried to create ordinary lives in the shadow of an institution built around discipline, readiness, and the possibility of violence far from home. On the surface, daily life remained stubbornly ordinary. Children still went to school with backpacks slung over small shoulders. Cashiers still counted bills at the end of long shifts. Retirees still sought familiar places to eat and rest. Elderly couples still kept lunch traditions. The ordinary persists even in places that live beside the machinery of war. In some ways, it becomes more precious there. Public spaces, such as cafeterias, beauty salons, pharmacies, hardware stores, and church halls become little sanctuaries of sameness. They are places where rank softens, where people stop performing endurance and simply exist as neighbors, customers, grandparents, office workers, widows, veterans, and friends. Luby's was one of those places. It belonged to the grammar of local life. It was not dramatic, not fashionable, not elite. It offered no spectacle. It offered food, steadiness, and the familiar comfort of repetition. For many people, especially older customers, that mattered more than novelty ever could. A cafeteria like Luby's did not demand anything from you except that you enter hungry and willing to carry a tray. There was a democracy in that simplicity. You joined the line. You looked through the glass. You chose what looked good that day. Fried fish, baked chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked soft, cornbread, pie under bright display lights, coffee poured into thick cups. The menu itself was part of the setting, because food in such places did more than feed the body. It reassured. It reminded people that the world could still produce something warm, recognizable, and shared. In a town shaped by military rhythms and frequent movement, that kind of reassurance had its own quiet value. By 1991, America itself was standing in a peculiar moment. The country had entered the decade with a sense of transition, uncertainty, and strain. The Gulf War had recently ended in a swift and highly publicized military victory, leaving behind a complicated mixture of patriotic confidence and deeper unease. Americans watched war live on television in a way that felt startlingly modern, precise, and distant all at once. Images of missiles, briefings, flags, maps, and uniforms had become part of the national bloodstream. In a place like Killeen, where military life was not abstract but woven into neighborhoods and households, those national moods landed differently. People there did not need television to remind them of war's existence. They lived beside it. They married it. They sent sons, daughters, husbands, wives, and friends into its orbit. And yet even in such a place, the violence that haunted the imagination still wore a foreign face. It belonged somewhere else first. It belonged on bases, in deployment zones and training grounds, in remembered battlefields in the stories old men told only when pressed. What people feared in daily civilian life was more familiar, more scaled to the ordinary world. A robbery, a drunken fight, a domestic dispute, an accident at an intersection. The possibility that a public lunchroom could become the scene of mass slaughter set outside the emotional expectations of most people. Even as America was beginning to develop a darker vocabulary around public shootings, there had already been other acts of mass murder in the country, enough to suggest that something was shifting, enough to unsettle the illusion that such events were unthinkable, but not yet enough to make them feel ambient. not yet enough to train the public mind to expect catastrophe in the middle of routine. That was part of what made Luby's such a brutal landmark. It arrived before this kind of horror had fully settled into American public consciousness as a recurring pattern. The nation knew violence. It did not yet know how often public normalcy could be ripped open by a heavily armed stranger. Killeen itself carried contradictions common to towns built around military installations. There was pride, but also weariness. There was structure, but also transience. There were communities of care, but also hidden loneliness. People knew each other and did not know each other. One family might have lived there for generations, another for only months. One man might wear his service history like armor, another like a wand he preferred not to touch. The city contained working-class discipline and private fragility in equal measure. The heat could be oppressive, the roads utilitarian, the storefronts plain. Yet within that plainness, people created habits of affection. Lunch after church, coffee with friends, cards in the afternoon, visits to relatives. Midweek errands followed by a decent meal before heading home. This was the background against which October 16th unfolded, not against chaos, but against pattern. Not against a city already collapsing, but against a community living inside its own familiar repetition. That repetition is essential to understanding the emotional shock of what happened. Violence does not become more terrible only because of its scale. Sometimes it becomes more terrible because of the calm surface it chooses to destroy. The victims were not gathered in a place associated with risk. They were gathered in a setting associated with predictability. Many were older adults, people whose relationship with public life is often shaped by routine rather than adventure. They had likely eaten there before. They probably knew the layout without thinking about it. They may have recognized staff members by face if not by name. The body relaxes in such places. It does so unconsciously. That is one of civilization's little gifts. We cannot live in permanent readiness. We need places where the shoulders drop, where the mind drifts, where a meal can be just a meal. Luby's represented that kind of place. In communities across America, cafeterias occupied a strangely intimate corner of public culture. They were not glamorous enough to attract attention, which is partly why they felt safe. They served office workers on break, retirees on schedule, families trying to feed children without fuss, widowed people who did not want to cook for one, churchgoers still wearing their Sunday best, old friends who preferred practical food and affordable prices to trendier pleasures. The room itself mattered. Cafeterias are open by design. They do not offer the compartmentalized privacy of a fine restaurant. You stand in a line under bright lights. You move along rails. You emerge with a tray and then search the room for a seat. Everyone is visible to everyone else. There is comfort in that openness, but there is also vulnerability. Once a room like that becomes dangerous, there are few places to disappear. The architecture of ease becomes the architecture of exposure. Yet on an ordinary day, nobody thinks in those terms. They think about whether the tea is sweet enough, whether the fish is fresh, whether the pie looks worth the extra money, whether the person they are meeting is already inside. That is the emotional innocence of public routine. It is not ignorance, it is trust, and trust, when shattered, leaves behind a special kind of grief. To understand the deeper context of the massacre, one must also understand the public conversation already simmering in America around violence, personal security, and firearms. Texas had its own strong traditions around self-reliance, gun ownership, and personal liberty, traditions bound up with frontier mythology, rural life, military culture, and a deeply rooted suspicion of being made helpless by outside authority. These values were not abstractions in many households. They were inherited attitudes, everyday assumptions, part of how people talked about responsibility and danger. But those attitudes existed alongside other impulses, the belief that public institutions should provide safety, the hope that law enforcement could respond quickly enough in crisis. the expectation that ordinary businesses and civic spaces would not become theaters of mass death. The early 1990s were a period in which those ideas were pressing against one another, not yet fully resolved, not yet hardened into the sharper political identities that would define later decades. The massacre at Luby's would not create those debates from nothing, but it would pour fuel onto them with terrible force. Before that happened, however, before speeches and advocacy and policy arguments attached themselves to the dead, there was simply the place itself and the people inside it. There was a restaurant in a Texas town on an ordinary autumn day. Autumn in Texas does not always look like the season in postcards. It does not necessarily arrive with crisp air, orange leaves, and sweaters. Often it arrives reluctantly, carrying the leftovers of summer. The light can still feel hard. The heat can still rise off concrete in slow shimmering waves. Air-conditioned interiors become their own separate climate, artificial islands of coolness where people linger a little longer than necessary. A cafeteria at midday becomes its own enclosed world full of soft clatter and casual waiting. The textures are humble: plastic trays, metal serving spoons, napkin dispensers, laminated tables, industrial carpet or tile, the low hum of refrigeration, and ceiling vents. There is nothing cinematic about such details until violence enters and turns every object into evidence, every angle into memory. But before that transformation, those details formed the plain fabric of safety. The massacre would later be remembered in numbers, in policy discussions, in anniversaries, and in the biographies of the dead. Yet the context of the event is not found only in its future significance. It is found in the unremarkable qualities that made the place human. The elderly patron balancing a tray with practiced caution, the family member offering an arm, the server moving through a shift without any idea that history is about to seize the room, the manager attending to practical concerns, the customers eating in the middle of their day thinking ahead not to danger but to errands, naps, appointments, school pickup, bills, and evening news. That is the moral weight of the setting. The people at Luby's were participating in ordinary civic life. They were doing what citizens in a functioning society are supposed to be able to do without fear: gather, eat, occupy shared space, move through the day unarmed by constant suspicion. Once that assumption is broken, something larger than the immediate body count is damaged. A city's emotional map changes. The boundaries between private caution and public trust shift. A restaurant is no longer just a restaurant. It becomes a reminder that safety can be perforated in seconds. Killeen, after the massacre, would be forced to carry that altered understanding. So would the country watching from elsewhere. But before the after came the before, and the before matters. It matters because memory is too easily flattened by the violence that follows. The before was a military town with civilian rituals, a community held together by ordinary needs and mutual recognitions. The before was a cafeteria that stood for continuity, affordability, and comfort. The before was a nation not yet fully accustomed to the recurring spectacle of public mass murder, still capable of being shocked in a more innocent register, still able to say this changes everything and mean it with rawness rather than weary repetition. The before was October sunlight on parked cars, the smell of food under fluorescent lights, the lone murmur of people who believed they were deep inside the protected middle of the day. This is the context in which the Luby's massacre must be placed. Not in abstraction, not only in statistics, but in the living texture of a town, a decade, and a public space that seemed too ordinary to become sacred through blood. Killeen was not a symbol when the day began. Luby's was not a battlefield. The customers were not yet victims, and the room had not yet been divided into the dead, the wounded, the hiding, the fleeing, and the forever changed. It was still just a place where people came to eat, rest, and continue with their lives. That is what makes the coming violence so historically significant and emotionally unbearable. It did not erupt in some dark corner already marked by menace. It erupted in the center of the known world, in a room built for nourishment, in a city used to the language of discipline and duty but not prepared for slaughter at the lunch hour. The context of this crime is the fragile trust of public life itself, and on that day in Killeen, that trust was about to be shattered in full view of the nation. The victim's statement, in a case like Luby's, does not live in a single courtroom sentence or one neat recollection offered under oath. It lives in fragments of interrupted afternoons, in the ordinary intentions people carried through the door that day, in the instincts that rose too late against an impossible kind of danger, and in the silence left behind by those who never had the chance to describe what they saw. It begins before the violence because victims do not appear first as victims. They appear as themselves. A woman smoothing the front of her blouse before stepping inside from the Texas glare. An older man guiding his tray with both hands, careful not to spill his tea. A married couple choosing the same table they might have chosen many times before, sitting down with the small, practiced ease of two lives that have learned each other's rhythms. Someone glancing toward the dessert counter and deciding to be sensible. Someone else deciding that today is the day for pie. A retired person relieved to be out of the house. A son taking a parent to lunch. A widow eating among strangers because a public room feels less lonely than a kitchen built for two and reduced to one. The victim's statement begins in these gestures because this is what violence destroys first, not just bodies, but the invisible architecture of ordinary intention. Each person inside that cafeteria had entered with a private purpose so small and human that it would never have been recorded if history had not intervened. They came hungry, tired, distracted, polite, aging, hopeful, hurried, content, frail, talkative, quiet. They came carrying habits instead of armor. They came expecting lunch. If this section is to speak for them, it must begin where their day began, in the texture of civilian life. The room was full of people who belonged to the hour in simple ways. Some were older, and age changes how a person occupies public space. The very young tend to rush through it, the middle-aged tend to measure it against schedules, but the elderly often settle into it with ritual. They know which entrance is easier, which table is quieter, which dish rarely disappoints. They carry a lifetime of repetition in the way they sit down. Many of those inside Luby's on that day had likely built their lives around repetition for decades. They knew the dignity of small routines. They knew the comfort of a familiar meal served in a familiar place. Some had lived through depression, war, illness, bereavement, childbirth, job loss, retirement, estrangement, reconciliation, and the thousand petty abrasions of adulthood. They had done what most people do. They had endured. There is something especially painful about the victim's side of this story because so many of the people caught in that room were not standing at the dramatic edge of life. They were in its middle stretches and final stretches, in its quiet chapters, in the part where routine is no longer boring but earned. They had raised children, buried parents, taken medicines on schedule, called relatives, folded laundry, worried over bills, fed pets, kept anniversaries alive. They had learned, perhaps, to cherish uneventful days. Then an uneventful day was taken from them in the most violent way imaginable, so the victim's statement is first a statement of stolen normalcy. It says we were here because we believed the world still allowed spaces like this. It says we were doing what people are meant to be able to do in peace. It says we were not symbols yet. We were just people. There is also the victim's statement that belongs to the survivors, and that kind of testimony is made not only of what they remember, but of what they can never stop remembering. The first seconds are often not clear in ordinary language. People do not describe them as a sequence so much as a rupture, a crash too big for the room, a sound that does not belong among trays and food and conversation, the sharp collapse of assumption. In such moments the mind resists. Public life trains us to interpret noise within ordinary limits. A dropped stack of plates, a slammed door, a vehicle outside, a kitchen accident, something startling but survivable. But then the pattern breaks. More sound, more force. Something inhuman in its persistence. People turning toward it before understanding it. Bodies freezing because disbelief arrives a fraction of a second before terror. That is part of the victim's statement too. It says no one is ever truly prepared for the moment when ordinary meaning disappears from sound. A room that 1 second ago held lunch begins to hold death, and the human mind stumbles as it crosses that border. Some victims would have seen almost everything at once. Others would have understood only through fragments, a movement at the edge of vision, a person dropping, a tray tipping, a scream arriving from somewhere behind them. A face-changing expression so suddenly it no longer looks familiar. The statement of the victims is full of these broken images because catastrophe does not present itself like a story with clean beginning, middle, and end. It comes in flashes, in misread details, in the terrible delay between seeing and believing. Someone may have thought at first that it could not be real. Someone may have looked down at food still on a plate and felt the absurdity of that image sear itself into memory. Someone may have reached instinctively for a spouse or parent or friend, not because there was a plan, but because the body seeks human contact when the world becomes incomprehensible. And there would have been those who tried, even in fear, to make sense of the room as if it were still a room governed by ordinary rules. Hide under the table, stay down, move to the side, help them up, get to the exit, do something. The helplessness of the victims does not erase their humanity, it reveals it. They were not passive figures arranged by fate. They were thinking, feeling, reacting, protecting, praying, crawling, shielding, bleeding, and trying to remain inside their own bodies while horror tore through the air around them. Among the survivors, the victim's statement is also a record of impossible choices. Public massacres compress morality into seconds. Do you run or stay with the person beside you? Do you look back? Do you drag someone heavier than you can manage? Do you risk movement when movement might draw attention? Do you flatten yourself to the floor and hope invisibility can be improvised from fear? Do you call out? Do you stay silent? There are choices no civilian should ever have to make, and yet people made them that day without rehearsal, without guidance, without enough time to weigh consequences. Some chose courage and paid for it with injury or death. Some chose concealment and lived with the guilt of survival afterward. Some tried to help wounded strangers while danger still filled the room. The victim's statement must honor all of these responses without arranging them into heroes and cowards, because terror destroys the luxury of moral performance. People do what they can with the body they have, the age they are, the injuries already sustained, the loved one beside them, the angle of the room, the pressure of panic inside the chest. To survive is not a verdict on character, and to die is not a failure of nerve. The victims at Luby's were trapped inside conditions no one deserves to face. Their statement says this too: do not judge us from the safety of hindsight. Another layer of the victim's statement comes from those who could no longer speak. In mass violence, the dead do not leave testimony in the usual sense, but they leave traces of intention and relationship that speak in their place. A handbag still looped over an arm. A table setting disturbed in a sudden diagonal of motion. A couple found close to one another because togetherness had outlived speech. A parent positioned by instinct between danger and family. These are not just forensic details. They are emotional statements written in posture and proximity. They say who mattered to whom in the last usable second. They say what the body tried to protect when the mind no longer had time to reason. They say love did not disappear when terror entered. It merely lost the race against it. In that sense, the victim's statement is also a statement of attachment. The massacre was not simply an event that struck isolated individuals. It tore through networks of care. Every person in that cafeteria existed at the center of some smaller world. Someone waited for them at home. Someone expected a phone call later. Someone knew how they took their coffee, what stories they repeated, which knee hurt in damp weather, which grandchild's photo they kept in a wallet, which route they preferred to drive. Violence ended lives in the room, but it also detonated outward into households, workplaces, churches, neighborhoods, and friendships. The victim's statement therefore belongs partly to the absent, to the spouse who set an extra place at dinner before the news arrived, to the child who did not yet know the adult world could fail so absolutely, to the relative who would later identify a body by details to intimate to share, to the friend who would hear what happened and feel the structure of reality tilt. When a massacre occurs, the victims are not only those present at the point of impact. The circle is wider, the statement grows larger, it becomes communal grief speaking in many voices at once. Yet there is something else the victims would say if memory could be gathered cleanly from the floor of that cafeteria. They would say that fear was not the only feeling in the room. There was also confusion, yes, and pain and shock, but also the stubborn persistence of human concern. Even in catastrophe, people notice each other. They ask if someone is alive. They whisper for silence so others may live. They pull at clothing, hands, sleeves, shoulders. They lean close enough to hear breathing. They try to comfort children. They pray not always for themselves, but for the person beside them. In that way, the victim's statement contradicts the killer's intention. Mass violence tries to reduce human beings to targets, bodies, obstacles, statistics. But inside the event, the victims continue to behave like people, which is to say they continue to recognize one another as people. A wounded stranger becomes someone to drag, cover, reassure, or mourn. The elderly become those who need help moving. The injured become those whose names matter even if they are never learned. The room becomes terrible, but not empty of meaning. If anything, meaning grows sharper under threat. That is why survivors so often remember tiny acts with unbearable clarity. A hand squeezed once under table, a glance exchanged before separation, a whispered instruction, a small effort at protection. Such moments are the human answer to annihilation. They do not cancel the horror, they stand against it. The victim's statement, then, is not only about suffering. It is about the last defense of personhood in a room that had been turned into a slaughter site. And when the gunfire stopped, the statement did not end, it merely changed form. Then came the dazed aftermath, the phase of survival in which people become aware of blood, of bodies not moving, of sounds outside the self, of sirens, shouting, commands, sobbing, and the strange humiliation of still being alive when others are not. Survivors often describe those moments as unreal, not because they were dreamlike, but because reality had exceeded the boundaries they once gave it. The room is the same room, yet nothing in it means the same thing. Tables are no longer for eating. They are shields, barriers, markers of where someone fell. The floor is no longer just the floor. It is where faces press for safety, where shoes slip, where people reach out, where death becomes visible. The victims who survived carried this altered geometry with them afterward. Many of them would no doubt have found that the massacre continued inside their bodies long after the event itself was over. Noise changed meaning, restaurants changed meaning, crowded rooms changed meaning, the idea of a normal lunch changed meaning. Trauma is also a kind of statement, though it speaks through sleeplessness, startle, silence, dread, and the inability to return fully to what once felt safe. If Part 3 must truly belong to the victims, then it must make room for this afterlife of injury. Some wounds closed, others did not. Some survivors learned to speak, others may have grown quieter. Some became public voices, others protected themselves by retreating from public language altogether. All of these, too, are forms of testimony. There is no single correct grammar for surviving the unimaginable. And perhaps the deepest statement the victims leave us is this: the event did not begin with spectacle, and should not end there either. It began with ordinary people carrying ordinary lives into an ordinary room. It continued through terror no one should have to narrate. It ended, for many, in absence. For others, It stretched onward into memory, scar tissue, guilt, grief, and public remembrance. To honor the victims is not to trap them forever in the moment of their destruction. It is to insist that before they were caught in history, they belonged to themselves. They laughed, aged, worried, cooked, served, prayed, drove, retired, visited, forgave, planned, and loved. Even in the seconds of greatest fear, they remained human beings rather than symbols. Their statement is the sum of that humanity under assault. It says we were here. It says we had names before headlines. It says the room was full not of abstractions, but of lives in progress. It says public safety is not an argument until it has first been a broken promise. It says memory owes the dead more than numbers, and owes the survivors more than curiosity. Above all, it says that on that day in Killeen, in the bright common space of a cafeteria, human beings faced terror with all the confusion, vulnerability, instinct, tenderness, and courage that human beings have ever had. That is the victim's statement. It is unfinished because some voices were taken before they could speak it aloud. But it remains unmistakable in the shattered routine, in the survivors' memories, in the grief of families, and in the enduring truth that what was destroyed that day was not only life, but trust itself, trust in the harmlessness of an ordinary afternoon, trust in the refuge of public routine, trust that a room full of people eating lunch would remain what it appeared to be, simply a room full of people eating lunch. At 12:39 p.m. on October 16, 1991, the ordinary rhythm inside Luby's cafeteria in Killeen broke apart with the force of metal and glass. The lunch crowd was unusually heavy that day, with roughly 150 people inside, in part because it was boss's day and many customers had come in groups, taking their supervisors or co-workers to lunch, filling the room with a thicker than usual layer of voices, trays, chairs, and movement. The people inside were doing what people do in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Some were still in line beneath the bright menu boards, staring through the steam fog, serving glass at vegetables, meats, and desserts. Some had already settled into booths or tables, moving salt shakers aside, unfolding napkins, cutting into food, or pausing in conversation. Staff worked the room with the mechanical focus of a busy lunch service, carrying plates, clearing trays, watching the line, trying to keep pace with the crush. Then a blue Ford Ranger pickup came violently through the cafeteria's plate glass front window, driving over the curb and into the dining area with such speed and brutality that for an instant it must have seemed like an accident, a freak loss of control, a catastrophe of machinery rather than intention. Glass exploded inward. The frame shrieked. Fragments flew across tables and floors. People turned in disbelief, some halfway out of their seats, others frozen with hands still on forks or cups. In public violence there is often that brief, treacherous second when the brain still tries to preserve the old world, when it searches for harmless explanations even as the new reality is already rushing in. At Luby's, that second ended almost immediately. The driver, George Hennard, began firing from inside the truck, and what had looked, for the blink of an eye, like a crash became unmistakably a deliberate attack. He was armed with two semi-automatic pistols, a Glock 17 and a Ruger P89, and he had entered not in panic but in purpose. The room had barely absorbed the sound of the vehicle smashing through the glass before it was overtaken by something worse. The cracking, repeated, and natural rhythm of gunfire in an enclosed space. Sound inside such a room does not behave cleanly. It slams off surfaces, ricochets through the body, distorts distance, turns direction into confusion. People do not hear it as one coherent source. They hear impact, echoes, screens, the skidding of chairs, the collapse of dishes, the instinctive voices of people dropping to the floor and calling out names. Hennard exited the truck and continued shooting, moving through the cafeteria while shouting misogynistic accusations and blaming women and the county for what he believed had been done to him. Witness accounts and later reporting described him as methodical, Not wild, not confused, not lashing out blindly in a single burst, but advancing through the room with a deadly steadiness, firing again and again into a space full of civilians with nowhere meaningful to go. He discharged about 80 rounds over the course of roughly 12 minutes, and the sheer compression of that violence is difficult to absorb even now. 12 minutes is almost nothing in ordinary life. It is a coffee break, a short wait at a counter, a pause between errands. In the cafeteria it became an entire landscape of terror, long enough for dozens of lives to be shattered, and short enough that almost no one had time to think beyond instinct. Wikipedia 1. The first victim identified in contemporary accounts was veterinarian Michael Griffith, and after that first fatal shot the room ceased to function as a restaurant in any recognizable sense. It became a geometry of desperate movement. Some people dropped where they stood, some crawled beneath tables, some tried to pull others down with them. Others, stunned by the speed of events, seemed to have been caught in the terrible human lag between seeing and acting, the fraction of time in which the mind still resists what the eyes already know. Hennard moved among customers and staff, firing at close range, and evidence later showed that many of the dead were shot in the head from point-blank distance. That detail alone reveals something chilling about the nature of the attack. This was not merely spraying bullets into a crowd from a fixed position. This was a man traversing the room, finding people in hiding places, turning the intimacy of the cafeteria against those inside it. One witness account recorded him taunting at least one woman as he found her trying to hide near the serving line. The dining room that had been arranged for visibility and easy movement now offered almost no concealment. Tables and booths that felt sturdy in ordinary life became thin illusions of protection. Beneath them, people pressed themselves flat against the floor, trying to reduce their bodies to shadow, trying not to breathe loudly, trying not to make the tiny noises that might betray them. Elderly customers, slower and less able to dive or crawl quickly, were especially exposed. The room was full of exactly the kinds of people least equipped to survive a sudden armed assault: older adults, lunchtime diners, workers caught mid-shift, people seated close together in a bright, open space never designed for defense. And yet within that helplessness there were acts of instinctive care. People shielded companions, some tried to drag the wounded, some stayed beside loved ones instead of fleeing. The incident was not only a slaughter, it was also a scene in which ordinary human attachment refused to vanish even under overwhelming danger. Wikipedia 1. The sensory violence of those minutes is impossible to overstate. Gunfire in a cafeteria does not arrive alone. It arrives braided with the smell of food abruptly contaminated by cordite and dust, with the glitter of broken safety glass under fluorescent lights, with the hot sting of blood in the air, with the clatter of trays kicked over in panic, with the wail and choking sob of people trying not to cry out too loudly. The bright domesticity of the room must have made the horror seem even less real. Vegetables, gravy, tea, pie displays, coffee cups, table condiments, all the soft props of a modest American lunch remained physically present as the massacre unfolded. That contrast is part of what makes the incident so enduringly disturbing. Death did not enter a dark alley or an isolated road. It entered a place designed for nourishment and routine, and for 12 minutes it made the ordinary grotesque. Outside, the violence was already drawing response. Police arrived and engaged Hennard, and there was a brief exchange of gunfire between him and officers. Reports indicate that police fired around 30 rounds during the confrontation, though only Hennard was struck by police bullets. Even with law enforcement on the scene, however, the terror inside did not end neatly. A public massacre is not like a film in which help arrives and instantly restores order. Officers had to approach a chaotic, still dangerous scene in which a heavily armed man remained mobile and defiant. They ordered him to surrender. He refused, reportedly saying he intended to kill more people. That refusal matters because it captures the unbroken momentum of his intent. This was not a man shocked by what he had done or pulled back by the sight of suffering. He remained fixed on extending it. That fact, more than any later profile or theory, defines the incident itself. In the middle of blood, panic, and police presence, he still wanted more death. Eventually, after being wounded by police and running low on ammunition, Hennard ended the massacre by shooting himself in the head. By the time it was over, 23 victims were dead and 27 others had been wounded, while the perpetrator became the 24th fatality. At the time, it was the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in modern United States history. Wikipedia won, but statistics are the cold afterimage. Inside the incident itself, what existed was a chain of individual experiences so intense they can only be imagined in fragments. A person under a table staring at shoes and broken glass, trying to tell from footsteps whether danger is approaching. A wounded diner feeling warmth spread through clothing and not yet understanding the full severity of injury. A staff member torn between hiding and helping. Someone whispering to a spouse who no longer answers. Someone else listening for sirens and praying they are not too late. There is also the cruel confusion of public shootings, where the body's survival instincts can contradict logic. Some people become very still, others move impulsively. Some try to run toward exits. Others flatten themselves and wait for the storm to pass over them. In a cafeteria, movement is constrained by furniture, other bodies, spilled food, shattered glass, and the sheer density of a crowd hit without warning. Every attempt to escape risks exposure. Every decision is made with incomplete knowledge. Is he near the front or the back? Is he reloading? Is that opening safe? Is the person beside me alive? Should I crawl or stay motionless? The victims inside Luby's had to answer these questions in seconds or not at all. The incident was therefore not a single burst of violence, but a sequence of hunted moments, each one forcing civilians into choices for which ordinary life offers no rehearsal. The attack also carried a terrible intimacy because Hennard's behavior suggested not only indiscriminate killing but selective cruelty, particularly toward women. Later reporting emphasized that many of his victims were female and that his shouted words during the attack were drenched in grievance against women. That misogynistic element gives the incident an additional layer of menace. It meant that for some victims, especially women who heard what he was saying, the attack was not only random public slaughter but targeted hatred made physical at arm's length. The cafeteria became the stage for an old poison in a new and devastating form. Personal resentment widened into collective punishment, a private pathology unleashed on strangers. Yet even with that ideological rage surging through his words, the reality on the floor remained fundamentally human. These were not symbols to the people crouching beneath tables. They were husbands, wives, co-workers, elderly friends, people in pain, people begging God under their breath, people watching the seconds drag and not knowing whether they would live to see the next one. Wikipedia won when the gunfire finally ceased. The silence would not have been true silence, seems like that continued to make noise long after the last shot. There are moans, shouts, police commands, radios, footsteps, the rattling breath of the wounded, the hysterical sound of people whose bodies are only now admitting fear. There is also the strange auditory emptiness left when a room built for chatter no longer contains ordinary conversation. Survivors emerging from beneath tables or from corners where they had curled into themselves would have looked out on a place they recognized physically, but no longer emotionally. The serving area was still there. The tables were still there. But the world had been rearranged by blood and sudden absence. In the aftermath, officers and emergency personnel moved through a room crowded with victims. And every inch of space had to be read now not as part of a restaurant, but as part of a crime scene and a rescue zone. For those still alive, help came amid confusion. For those who had died, there was no dramatic closure, only the blunt reality. that lunch had become the last act of their lives. What gives the incident its continuing force in American memory is not only the death toll but the way the massacre unfolded in full violation of every social promise the setting seemed to make. A cafeteria implies safety through familiarity. Its openness suggests communal ease, not tactical exposure. Its midday business suggests life proceeding as it should. Hennard's attack turned each of those assumptions inside out. The openness made hiding difficult. The midday crowd increased vulnerability. The familiarity delayed comprehension. And the bright public normalcy of the room made the violence feel almost unbearable in its obscenity. This is why the incident still feels so haunting when described plainly. A man drove a truck through the front of a crowded cafeteria and shot people at lunch. There is no ornament that can make that sentence more terrible than it already is. Its horror lives in its simplicity. It tells us that catastrophe does not need darkness, secrecy, or elaborate staging. It can arrive under fluorescent lights while people are eating vegetables and drinking tea. It can begin with shattered glass and continue in the small distances between tables. It can last 12 minutes and scar a country for decades. And in Killeen that afternoon between 12:39 and 12:51 p.m., that is exactly what happened. 23 innocent people were killed, 27 wounded, and an ordinary cafeteria was transformed into one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern American history. Wikipedia 1. When the gunfire ended inside Luby's cafeteria in Killeen, the room did not instantly become quiet in any human sense. It became something worse, a public space still vibrating with panic, blood, shock, and the stunned disbelief that follows concentrated violence. What had been, moments earlier, a crowded lunchroom on Boss's Day was now one of the most devastating crime scenes in modern Texas history. Roughly 150 customers and employees had been inside when George Hennard drove his blue 1987 Ford Ranger through the plate glass front window at about 12:39 p.m. Then opened fire with a Glock 17 and a Ruger P89, killing 23 people and wounding 27 before dying by suicide after a brief exchange with police. Investigators arriving at the scene were not entering a mystery in the abstract. They were stepping into a room where the shape of the attack had already written itself onto every surface: shattered storefront glass, the truck lodged in the dining area, shell casings scattered across the floor, tables overturned or abandoned mid-meal, and victims struck in positions that showed how little warning they had been given and how little cover the cafeteria could provide. Early reporting and later historical summaries agree on several central facts that would have immediately framed the first phase of the investigation. The attack had begun with a deliberate vehicle ramming through the front of the restaurant. The gunman had moved through the room firing at patrons and staff. He had reloaded multiple times. Many of the fatal wounds were inflicted at close range, and the scene itself strongly suggested that women had been singled out with particular hostility. Encyclopedia Britannica 1. The front of the restaurant told the first part of the story almost at a glance. This was not a hidden approach, not a sniper's distant angle, not a covert entrance. The attack had begun with spectacle and force, the truck smashing through the plate glass so violently that some inside first assumed it was a terrible accident. That initial misreading became one of the earliest and most heartbreaking clues about the crime scene itself. The patrons had been caught in the vulnerable interval between collision and comprehension. Some people reportedly moved toward the truck believing the driver might need help before Hennard started shooting. In practical investigative terms, that mattered. It explained why the first fatal victim, veterinarian Michael Griffith, was near the truck and why the first seconds of the massacre had the confusing physical signature of two events layered on top of each other, a crash and a shooting. The broken facade, the truck's final position, and witness accounts all pointed to the same conclusion almost immediately. This had been a planned assault that used the crash not as an accident but as an opening act, a way to penetrate the building, create shock, and pin the room in place before the gunfire fully began. Encyclopedia Britannica 1 inside, the crime scene would have presented investigators with a terrible map of the gunman's movement. Public accounts describe Hennard as moving through the cafeteria rather than simply firing from one fixed point, and the pattern of casualties reinforced that impression. 10 victims were reported to have been killed by single point-blank shots to the head, a detail that immediately changed the emotional and forensic reading of the room. It suggested not only volume of fire but proximity, not only rage, but deliberate finishing shots delivered at close range. That kind of evidence makes a scene feel more intimate in the worst possible way. It means the killer was not acting from the emotional distance of a doorway alone. He was advancing among hiding, crouching, wounded, or defenseless people, and selecting some of them from within the clutter of tables and benches. The cafeteria's openness, which on a normal day was part of its comfort, became part of the evidence too. There were no sealed rooms, no strong barriers, no safeguarders. Investigators would have seen quickly how few hiding places had really existed. Booths and tables might conceal a body from casual sight, but they offered almost no ballistic protection. The placement of victims under tables, near the serving line, and the long attempted escape paths would have shown both the instinct to hide and the futility of hiding in a room never designed to withstand an armed assault. Wikipedia to the shell casings, the pauses in firing, and witness descriptions of lulls would also have given police their first structural outline of the shooting. Hennard fired about 80 rounds and reloaded at least 3 times before the confrontation ended, while police fired roughly 30 rounds and struck only Hennard. Those numbers, combined with the distribution of victims and surviving witnesses, would have allowed investigators to begin reconstructing the cadence of the massacre almost immediately. This was not a single burst of chaos lasting only a few seconds. It unfolded over roughly 12 minutes, long enough for Hennard to move, speak, reload, and continue hunting within the room, and long enough for some patrons to exploit a break in the gunfire to flee. One of the earliest and most vivid clues about survival routes came from the rear of the cafeteria, where Tommy Vaughn, trapped near a window, threw himself through it, creating an opening that allowed others to escape. That detail mattered to investigators, not merely as an act of desperation but as a practical clue to sequencing. It helped explain why a portion of the crowd managed to get out despite the density of the attack and why some survivors later emerged from areas that might otherwise have seemed trapped. The crime scene was not static. It contained evidence of movement under fire, of people crawling, pressing under furniture, surging toward openings, and seizing tiny chances when the shooting paused. Wikipedia too, yet the physical evidence alone was not what gave the first investigators their earliest sense of motive. That came from a combination of the victim's demographics, the gunman's own shouted words during the attack, and accounts from witnesses who heard him curse women specifically. Contemporary and later sources consistently report that Hennard yelled statements blaming women in Killeen and Belton and blaming Bell County for what had been done to him, describing the massacre as payback. Witnesses also recalled him insulting female victims directly before shooting them, and the final toll reflected that gendered hostility. A majority of those killed were women, with several accounts putting the number at 14 of the 23 victims. In the first hours after the massacre, investigators did not need a long behavioral profile to notice that pattern. The scene itself pointed in that direction. The words heard in the room, the concentration of female victims, and the taunting language used at close range all suggested that misogyny was not incidental but central. Killeen's police chief said early on that Hennard appeared to have an evident problem with women, and that conclusion did not arise from rumor alone. It arose from what the crime scene, the witnesses, and the casualty pattern were already saying together. Wikipedia too. There were also subtler early clues, the kind investigators often gather in the blur between crime scene processing and background interviews. Hennard's life in the days and weeks before the massacre had left behind verbal warnings that only became legible after the bloodshed. A convenience store clerk later said he had told her to warn people that if they did not stop messing around his house, something awful was going to happen. A co-worker said that about a week and a half before the massacre, Hennard talked about women in Belton who had given him problems and kept saying, "Watch and see." A restaurant manager who encountered him the night before the shooting described a furious outburst while television coverage of Anita Hill appeared during the Clarence Thomas hearings. None of those clues would have been visible in the cafeteria itself, but together they formed the first ring of explanation around the crime scene. Police processing the restaurant could see how the attack had happened. Interviews outside it began to suggest why it had taken this shape, and why women in particular had been placed at the center of his rage. These were not yet neat answers. They were fragments, unstable and emotionally charged. But investigations begin in fragments, a phrase overheard, a prior threat, a fixation that seemed petty until it turned lethal. In the Luby's case, the early clues outside the cafeteria reinforced what the scene inside had already implied. This was a grievance-soaked attack driven by paranoia, resentment, and hatred directed outward at strangers who had become stand-ins for the enemies inside his mind. Wikipedia to the final location of Hennard's body supplied another crucial clue about the last phase of the attack. After police arrived and exchanged gunfire with him, he retreated toward the area between the two bathrooms, where people were hiding and blocking the doors. Officers ordered him to surrender, but reports say he refused, declaring that he was going to kill more people. Wounded in the abdomen, low on ammunition, and with one weapon effectively exhausted, he then shot himself in the head with his final bullet. That ending narrowed several investigative questions almost at once. There was no prolonged search for an escaping suspect. There was no realistic basis for a second gunman theory in the face of the physical evidence. The firearms were present, the truck was present. The trajectory of the attack, from entry through confrontation to suicide, was materially anchored in one location and one perpetrator. In many mass casualty events, the first investigative hours are clouded by uncertainty about whether the attacker has fled, whether there are accomplices, whether explosives are involved, or whether another assault is imminent. At Luby's, the scene was ghastly, but it also answered some of those questions quickly. The killer was dead at the scene. His weapons were there. The route of attack was visible. The broad sequence was painfully clear. That clarity did not reduce the horror, but it did allow investigators to move more quickly from immediate threat containment into victim identification, witness collection, and motive development. Wikipedia too. Even so, crime scenes of this scale are never fully clear in the emotional sense. The initial clues at Luby's did not remove ambiguity from the human story. They only outlined the skeleton of the event. On that skeleton lay hundreds of details investigators had to sort. Who had been where at the beginning, who was struck by the gunman, and who had been wounded in the confusion of escape. Who had heard which words when the reloading pauses occurred, how police lines of fire intersected with the dining room, and how many of the dead had been trying to shield others. Some of those questions could be answered with ballistics, body positions, and witness accounts. Some could only be approached. The very openness of the cafeteria made the scene more complex. So many people had been present, so many had moved under terror, and so many memories had been formed under conditions of extreme shock that the first statements would inevitably contain distortion, gaps, and overlapping impressions. Yet certain realities remained stable across accounts and quickly hardened into the essential early findings. The truck crash was deliberate. The gunman acted alone. The attack was prolonged enough to involve movement and reloading. Women were heavily targeted, and the verbal content of the massacre pointed toward misogynistic grievance rather than robbery, hostage-taking, or random madness devoid of direction. Encyclopedia Britannica 1. What the investigators saw in that cafeteria, then, was not merely a scene of mass death. It was a scene whose first clues were brutally legible. The glass said forced entry by vehicle. The shell casings and body distribution said movement through the room. The wound pattern said close-range execution in multiple cases. The survivor pathways said there had been brief lulls and desperate improvisation. The shouted words and gender pattern among the dead said hatred of women was central to the assault. The final position of the gunman said the attack ended only when he could no longer continue it. In one sense, that gave police and reporters an unusually immediate outline. In another, it made the scene even more haunting because there was no puzzle box elegance to it, no hidden mechanism waiting to be uncovered. The truth announced itself with almost obscene directness. A man drove into a cafeteria full of people and turned it into a slaughterhouse because his grievances, his paranoia, and his hatred had found a public stage. The cafeteria floor, still scattered with broken dishes and lunch trays among the shell casings and blood, held that truth before any press conference ever did. And that is what makes Part 5 of this story so chilling. The crime scene did not merely preserve the violence, it testified to it. It showed investigators exactly what civilization looks like when its most ordinary setting is ripped open by a single rendezvous. It showed them a truck where there should have been only windows, execution-style wounds where there should have been only conversation, and early clues so stark that the case began almost at once to speak for itself. Encyclopedia Britannica 1. Part 6 begins in the strange hour after certainty has arrived too quickly. In some investigations, detectives spend days or weeks chasing shadows, unsure whether they are dealing with one offender or several, unsure whether the violence was personal or ideological, unsure whether the suspect fled into the world or lies dead at the center of the crime scene. At Luby's, some of those questions closed almost immediately. George Hennard was dead inside the cafeteria after being wounded by police and then shooting himself. His truck was still jammed through the plate glass entrance. And the physical evidence made clear that this had been a single gunman assault carried out with 2 semi-automatic pistols over roughly 12 to 14 minutes. Police also had early witness accounts that he had shouted hatred at women and appeared to target many of them deliberately. In one sense, then, the case seemed brutally simple from the first day. In another sense, it opened into a different kind of maze, the kind investigators face when the suspect is dead. The motive is soaked in grievance but not neatly rational. And the public wants an answer larger than the facts are immediately able to provide. 23 people had been killed, and many more wounded. A town wanted to know why this place had been chosen, why these people had died, whether anyone had missed warning signs, and whether some deeper conspiracy or hidden trigger lay behind the massacre. The investigation had a perpetrator almost at once. What it did not yet have was an explanation that felt proportionate to the devastation. Encyclopedia Britannica 1. The first dead end was the most human one, the hope that there must be a clear and specific target hidden somewhere inside the horror. After mass violence, people instinctively search for a private logic. They want to believe the killer came for a particular person, a former lover, an enemy, a boss, a witness, someone whose name can serve as the key to the whole event. That kind of explanation does not make the suffering smaller, but it makes it legible. It suggests that the violence, however monstrous, still obeyed some grim internal map. Investigators examining Luby's had reason to consider that possibility in the beginning because Hennard had spoken during the attack about Bell County, Belton, and women who had supposedly wronged him. Yet the more they dug, the less evidence there was that the cafeteria itself contained a single intended victim or that the location had been chosen because one particular person would be present there that afternoon. Even later summaries note that it remains unclear why he chose that specific Luby's branch. The restaurant had opened only about 2 years earlier, was crowded because of Boss's Day, and sat beside a major thoroughfare near Fort Hood. But no authoritative source has established that Hennard went there to find one known individual. That absence matters. It pushed the investigation away from a tidy revenge plot and toward something more diffuse and more unsettling, a public massacre driven by generalized grievance rather than a narrow vendetta. San Antonio Express-News to that conclusion, however, was not emotionally satisfying. And cases like this often generate rumors precisely because the available truth feels too thin against the scale of loss. A second dead end formed around the question of accomplices, or a broader plan. When violence is this large, the imagination resists the idea that one damaged man could cause it alone. People wonder whether someone helped procure weapons, encouraged him, rode with him, or knew more than they admitted. But the early investigation did not produce evidence of a second gunman or an active co-conspirator at the scene. Hennard drove the truck himself, carried the pistols himself, moved through the cafeteria himself, and died there with ammunition still on him. Police, and later reporting, consistently treated the massacre as the work of a single perpetrator, not a team. That did not eliminate the possibility that people around him had noticed instability or heard threats, but it did narrow the operational mystery. Investigators were not chasing fugitives across Texas. They were reconstructing the path of one man whose inner collapse had become public slaughter. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of the Luby's investigation. It was not a whodunit. It was a why did he, and those are often harder because the evidence can be plentiful without ever becoming complete. https://www.kwtx.com 3 As detectives turned outward from the cafeteria and began building Hennard's recent history, another dead end appeared in the form of scattered warning signs that did not add up to a preventable script. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as erratic, prejudiced, frightening, and increasingly unstable in the period before the massacre. One neighbor later said he was the scariest man she had ever seen. Accounts collected after the shooting said he made angry gestures at passing motorists, peered into windows, skulked in bushes, and carried himself like a man stewing inside his own resentments. Earlier in his working life, he had served in the Navy, later worked in the Merchant Marine, lost that work after drug-related problems, and struggled to regain his papers. There were pieces of deterioration everywhere investigators looked, yet that is precisely what made the investigation so frustrating. Pieces are not the same as a line. Plenty of unstable men do not become mass killers. Plenty of angry remarks never become murder. Plenty of social failures curdle into loneliness without turning into massacre. What police found in Hennard's background was not a single trigger that could explain the event cleanly, but a trail of bitterness, failed reintegration, paranoid ideation, and hostility toward whole categories of people. Those findings deepened the portrait without resolving it. Wikipedia, for the most glaring through-line investigators uncovered, was his hatred of women, but even that, while obvious, did not close the case in a satisfying way. Early in the investigation, the Killeen police chief said Hennard clearly seemed to have a problem with women. Witnesses said he screamed abuse at female patrons during the attack, and later accounts reported that he had passed over some men to shoot women instead. A majority of those killed were women, and some were taunted before being shot. Outside the cafeteria, people who had known him recalled the same poison in less lethal form. Former acquaintances said he called women snakes, made degrading remarks about them, and grew especially contemptuous after conflicts with his mother. A later local report said he had even filed a bogus complaint with the FBI earlier in 1991 claiming that Caucasian women in America had somehow formed a coalition not to date him. For investigators, these details established an important pattern. They showed that the misogyny on display in the cafeteria was not invented in the moment. It had been part of his worldview already. But that pattern still stopped short of a fully coherent motive. Hatred of women explained the character of the attack, its language, and much of its victim selection. It did not fully explain why that day, why that cafeteria, or why his private delusions crossed into public annihilation at that exact hour. Wikipedia for investigators also ran into the familiar dead end of retrospective prophecy, the way everyone suddenly remembers the warning signs only after the dead are already dead. A convenience store clerk reportedly said he had warned that something awful was going to happen if people did not stop bothering his house. A coworker said that about a week and a half before the massacre, Hennard complained about women in Belton and kept saying to wait and see. A restaurant manager described him as furious the night before the killings while watching television coverage connected to the Clarence Thomas hearings and Anita Hill. Each of these details felt significant in retrospect, and together they built the image of a man approaching ignition. But hindsight can deceive investigators as much as it informs them. After a catastrophe, every strange sentence begins to sound like a prophecy. Every outburst becomes a clue that should have been understood. Every act of social malfunction acquires the glow of inevitability. Police had to separate what was genuinely predictive from what only looked predictive because the massacre had already happened. That is a difficult task in any case, and especially in one where the suspect is dead and cannot be interrogated. A living suspect can be confronted with timelines, challenged on contradictions, and pushed to explain choices. A dead suspect leaves only traces, and traces often tempt the living into building too much certainty out of fragments. Wikipedia for there was also a social dead end at the heart of the investigation, one that no amount of evidence could solve. The community wanted meaning, but the kind of meaning police can deliver is limited. Detectives can identify the shooter, trace the weapons, map his movements, interview witnesses, search his home, collect statements from former friends and co-workers, and assemble a chronology of decline. They cannot always produce a reason that feels morally proportionate to the dead. Britannica's summary, even after decades of hindsight, still states that no motive was ever firmly established. Though it notes his recent dismissal from the Merchant Marine and his later description as a loner, that does not mean there was no motive in the broad sense. There clearly was, at minimum, a toxic mix of misogyny, paranoia, social rejection, and grievance. It means only that the investigation never found a neat explanatory engine, no manifesto that settled everything, no single grievance that unlocked the whole structure. No target list proving that this location had been selected for a precise strategic reason. Instead, the investigators faced what so many mass casualty investigations eventually face, a suspect whose psychology is visible enough to describe and too disordered to justify. The gap between those two things is where the dead end lives. Encyclopedia Britannica one another painful avenue involved the question of prevention. Once police understood how openly Hennard had broadcast parts of his instability, people naturally wondered whether anyone had failed to act. Had neighbors dismissed behavior that should have prompted a call? Had employers overlooked something more dangerous than near misconduct? Could prior drug problems, job loss, or threatening remarks have triggered an intervention strong enough to stop him? The investigation could gather those pieces, but it could not transform them into a single missed lever that would have saved Luby's. He had been honorably discharged from the Navy years earlier, later dismissed from the Merchant Marine, and had entered a drug treatment program in Houston after drug-related trouble. He had alienated people. He had become increasingly bizarre. Yet none of those facts alone drew a straight legal or institutional path to prevention. This is one reason the case